Hey guys, I'm Dave Trull, and welcome to the Trull Gallery. If you're like me, shop space is tight. Every time I use my table saw or planer, I roll it out, do what I have to do, and roll it back out of the way again. This makes using Outfeed tables a challenge. I need something that's going to support my work, but not get in the way when I'm not using it. In this video, we're going to build an Outfeed table that attaches to my Bosch table saw and folds up out of the way when I'm not using it. This is a prototype build, which means I'm not really working off any plans. I'm just kind of shooting from the hip. Let's see how this one goes. I had some scraps of 3/4 inch birch plywood kicking around, so I started by cutting them to length. The rear rail on this saw is 29 inches, so I cut the stock to that length. Next, I ripped these pieces to width. The bottom rail was ripped at 3 1/8 inches, and the rear rail was ripped at 1 5/8 initially, but more on that later. Here I clamped everything together to check the fit. The spacing allowed the fence of the saw to move with ease. I didn't like the fact that the top of the rear rail was plywood. I thought it would be better with something more durable. I had some scrap maple laying around, so I glued that to the top of the rail. That should hold up well. While the glue was drying, it was time to think about fastening the bottom rail to the fence rail. This is what the fence rail looks like. After some head scratching, I decided to fill the lower section with some wood in the hopes of making the connection a little bit stronger. I milled some scrap poplar to fit snugly in that cavity. This ended up being 0.78 of an inch wide by 0.27 inches thick. I also cut it to 27 5/8 inches long to allow for the rail caps to fit back into place. Before adding the piece, I eased the corners with some light hand sanding and slid it in place. The caps were popped back in to keep everything nice and neat. I marked the location of the holes on the fence rail using blue tape and a pen. Then I held the bottom rail in place with a couple of clamps and transferred the lines over. After marking the 3 holes with a punch, I drilled an 1/8 inch pilot hole. It was tight quarters, so I got out my 90-degree drill attachment for the job. I drilled through the bottom of the fence rail, the poplar filler, and the next web in the fence rail as well. I thought this would give me plenty of meat for the bolts to hold on to. I switched to a number 7 drill for the final hole. This is the correct pilot bit for a 1/4-20 tap that I decided to use. Once the hole was drilled, I could come back with my tap and thread the assembly. I repeated this for all 3 mounting holes. I can now head over to the drill press and drill the clearance holes for the bottom rail. I used a 17/64 bit and drilled all 3 holes, just to give me a little clearance. Using the fence helps register the work here. While I was at the drill press, I pre-drilled the holes to mount the rear rail. I used a tapered bit with a countersink and pre-drilled the 3 locations. I also made sure that I drilled these holes from the bottom side. Now that the glue had time to dry on the rear rail, I trimmed off the excess maple and sanded it smooth. I decided that a better height for this piece would be 1 11/16. After clamping everything back in place, the rear rail now sat about a 1/16 inch below the height of the table. This will prevent stock from catching as it moves from the saw table to my new Outfeed table. Just to make sure nothing catches, I added a small chamfer to the inside of the rear rail. Another quick sanding and it was ready to go. It was time to join the rear rail to the bottom rail. I started by clamping the 2 together, making sure to line them up carefully. Then I pre-drilled through the holes I had already drilled on the bottom rail, this time into the rear rail. Then I added some glue and a few number 8 by 2 inch screws and set it aside to dry. Once that assembly was dry, I could bolt it to the saw for the first time and make sure that everything was lined up. With the rail assembly in place, I can now cut the 1/2 inch birch plywood table to size. I don't have a fancy track saw yet, so I pulled out the shop-made version I've had forever and cut the table to 29 inches wide and 26 inches across. I picked up a 30-inch piano hinge and cut it to 28.5 inches long with my angle grinder and a cutoff wheel. Then I cleaned up the edge with a file to remove any burrs. It was time to attach the piano hinge to the tabletop. I centered it from side to side and kept the barrel of the hinge even with the edge of the table. I pre-drilled the holes with a self-centering Vicks bit and then drove a screw on each end. Then I went back and drilled and added screws until they were all in place. I repeated that process, attaching the other half of the piano hinge to the rail assembly. I'd removed it from the saw so it would be easier to install the hinge. It was tight quarters as it was, and I wasn't real happy with the alignment, but I thought I could live with that minor error. After remounting the whole thing to the saw, I realized I had another alignment issue. I noticed that moving the fence all the way to the right, the table moved smoothly. But returning the fence to the left, the table would catch on a bolt on the stand, preventing it from sliding unless I lifted the table around the bolt. These are the things you find when you design on the fly. It's time to prepare the leg stock. I had some 3/4 inch plywood that was just longer than I needed, and I ripped 2 pieces at 2 inches wide on the table saw. I adjusted my fence to 1.25 inches and ripped 2 more pieces. When assembled, this would give me 2 L-shaped legs with 2-inch sides. It's time to assemble the legs. I started by adding glue to one end of the 1.25 inch piece. The second strip here is just to help balance the other side while I work on the leg. With the glue in place, I added the 2-inch strip, aligned the edges, and tacked them in place with 1.25 inch finish nails. Brads or even pins would work here, but this gun was handy. I also made sure not to nail where I'd be cutting the legs to length later. With the 2 legs glued together, I decided to add a solid maple foot in the hopes that it would wear better. Again, a little glue and a few nails hold these in place. While the legs were drying, it was time to fix that little spacing error. I cut off the top of the rear fence assembly and milled up some walnut to the same thickness as my table stock. I ripped the walnut to 2 inches, put a chamfer on this stock as I did before, and glued this to the fence assembly. That was enough space for the table to clear the stand bolt when folded up. The table was attached to the walnut with the piano hinge, and this time the alignment was perfect. Before attaching the assembly, I took the time to mark out the locations of the saw's miter slots on the walnut. While the slots on my saw are 3/4 inch wide and 3/8 inch deep, I chose to make these slots on the walnut just a bit oversized, just so things don't catch later. I made the cuts with a dado set in my miter gauge with a sacrificial fence to prevent blowouts. I also made sure to remove any of the hinge screws from these areas. With the assembly back on my table saw, I could check the legs for length. I used my level to show me the height of the saw table and let the outfeed table sit just below that. That would allow the table to support long stock, but not let it catch as it passes across. With the length of the table determined, I used my crosscut sled on the table saw to cut them to length. Before removing the outfeed table from the saw, I decided to locate the hole for the dust collection port. You could just do this by measuring, but since I have a laser, I thought I'd try that. I lined up the laser with the center of the dust port, lowered the table, and marked the location of the laser line on the table. Then I lifted the table, switched the laser line, and transferred that to the table as well. I'm not sure why I didn't do both lines at once, but this still worked. I used a straight edge to connect the lines I had marked to locate the center point, then used a compass to draw a 3-inch circle. To cut out the hole, I started with a 3/8 inch brad point bit in my drill just inside the circle I'd drawn. I could then use my jigsaw and carefully cut to the line. A little light sanding and it was ready to go. I did decide to put a 1/4 inch roundover on the circles I just cut out, just so things would be smooth. Now it's time to mount the legs to the underside of the table. I picked a pair of 2-inch hinges and attached them to the 2-inch side of each leg. I centered the hinge on the leg, set the barrel of the hinge so it was flush with the top of the leg, and pre-drilled with the self-centering VIX bit. Then the hinges were screwed in place using the included fasteners. To mount the legs to the underside of the table, I set the first leg a 1/4 inch in from both sides of the table. Again, pre-drilling with a VIX bit and attaching the hinge to the table with the included fasteners. I double-checked that everything was square before setting the second screw. Since the legs are longer than my table is wide, the 2 legs must be offset. I made sure that the first leg was in the correct location, then I measured over a 1/4 inch up from that, and a 1/4 inch in from the edge. Then this leg was attached just like the first. I planned on using magnets to hold the legs in place when the table was folded. So I marked the locations for the magnets on both legs, clamped them in the correct location, and used an 1/8 inch drill bit to create a pilot hole for the magnets. While I drilled all the way through the legs, I didn't want extra holes in the table face, so I kept the bit shy of going through. I moved to my drill press and drilled the holes for the magnets. The magnets I had were 3/8 of an inch in diameter, so I chucked up a 3/8 inch Forstner bit and set the depth so it would just hold 2 of the small magnets I had. I drilled the top, reset the depth, and drilled the legs in the same way. To ensure I got the polarity correct when I installed the magnets, I started with them in stacks of 4, 2 for each side. I used a Sharpie to mark the outer 2 faces, and those would be the sides glued into the pieces. A little super glue in the hole, followed by a magnet, Sharpie side down, a little more super glue, and the second magnet pretty much jumps right into place. I repeated the same process on the other side, making sure that the Sharpie side goes in first. It's time for the final assembly. The legs help hold the table in place, while I juggled bolting the assembly to the table saw fence. With everything in place, it's time to make sure that the table opens and closes easily, and I can still plug my shop vac in when the table is folded up. I think we're pretty much there. There's one last thing to do, and that's to make a test cut. I grabbed a piece of plywood that would have made for an awkward cut before and ran it across the saw and outfeed table. This is so much easier than it was before. This outfeed table is going to make my table saw safer and easier to use from now on. I don't have to worry about the stock dipping off the end of the table or lifting away from the blade at the end of the cut. And since I have no spare room in my shop, the ability to fold the table down out of the way is going to be super helpful. If I was going to do something like this again, I'd probably go with stronger magnets, but I'll deal with what I have for now. If you'd like to build this table for yourself, I'll put a link below with a set of plans that you can download. Not quite there yet, but I'll post them shortly. And while these plans are specific to the Bosch table saw, I'll also include tips how you could adapt it to your table saw as well. I hope you enjoyed this video and found something useful out of it. If you did, give us a thumbs up. Maybe share it with some friends. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you get notified every time I put out a new video. There's a bunch of new stuff coming down the line. And I haven't mentioned it lately, but the architect's getting closer on the drawings for the new shop. So until that happens, we're going to be working here, making dust, and having a good time. So for now, have a great day. Stay safe. We'll talk to you soon.